Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. And as people come in, we'll welcome them. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Paul asked if everyone could answer questions throughout. I think let's keep it flexible and proceed that way. But I do have Q&A at the end. So the intent is to have this be thought-provoking and hopefully give you a different view on how things can help you without being being very, very difficult to handle. So we're going to talk about how Google Analytics, how you can use Google Analytics to strengthen any case you have for improving usability or user experience. And as Paul said, I'm the CEO, founder of ClickInsight. And we were chatting before, and I said that the reason I got into analytics was actually because I needed to quantify usability observations that we were seeing. So we would bring in 30 people, and then there would be a problem that we would detect. As you know, if you have 5 or 6, you start to want to take action at that point. But we would get pushback. That's only 5 or 6 people had that problem. How do you know that that's going to be a problem elsewhere? And so that's how I got involved in wanting to look at the data. Okay, great. Let's see if we can actually find that pattern on the website. And it could be things like they can't find something and what were you thinking of? And they would say the term. So then we would want to find on the website that people actually search. Is that how they when they're looking for something, is that what happens? And so that's how I got into it. And my first analytics course was actually at a Nielsen Norman conference in New York, where I went down there, and it was 2 days of usability training and 1 day of analytics. And that's when I got started and eventually have moved off into that area. So I have been to TorCHI events. I think it's probably been about 5 or 6 years. I was a member at one point, and there's also the Toronto Usability Group, and that's actually where I met Ilona. And Paul and I, we figured we've met before, but I can't remember if it's at a TorCHI event or IBM. Okay, so this is how people think of Google Analytics, or the digital equivalent. And people, you log in, and what you see are hundreds of reports in the left navigation. And as you start to learn about this, you see that there are other reports if you click on certain tabs in the report itself. And so there's probably about 300 reports that are there, and then you can create other reports, and it just seems like a lot to do. So the thing is to not start with Google Analytics or any analytics tool, and you should really start with whatever it is you want to learn. And in a lot of cases, what you'll find if you proceed that way is that it's a lot more sane, and you get what you need without having to drown in the data and worry about needing to learn all of Google Analytics. So with respect to user experience design, usability, all those areas, and the practices of digital analytics and usability actually reinforce each other, and you hold each other up, and depending on what's happening, one will inform the other. And very much so, we rely as digital analysts on user experience design, usability studies, and that kind of thing, because the qualitative experience and what the users will tell you when you are doing either customer feedback or doing usability study is that we'll find out the why. Because digital analytics, what it does is it measures, collects data, all sorts of different types of data, but you can't read the person's mind. But a usability study, when you probe and get them to say what they were thinking, that definitely is way more helpful. So digital analytics is an enabler, and we can collect data from all these different devices, phones, shopping carts, even if there's a tablet there, in store, and even game boxes, cash registers, point of sale, all sorts of different areas. So it's more the Internet of Things can actually be collected in tools like Google Analytics. But the thing to note and to remember is that digital analytics is actually process. So a lot of people equate digital analytics and Google Analytics as the starting point and the be all end all, and that's what it means, is all that data. But really, it's a process for measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of internet data. And it's an enabler because it's not the be all end all itself. We're doing this because what we want to do is understand and optimize usage on digital properties. So you folks, human factors, are interested in the user experience and identifying what's happening and what's not. And digital analytics, it's the same thing. So in a lot of cases, we actually consider the information that you would collect in a usability study as internet data as well, because that helps us decide and what to do to improve the performance. It's not just that we look at the reports in Google Analytics or any of the other data collection tools and that's it. Okay. So to avoid being in the position of that lady there drowning in data or the digital equivalent, our recommendation is always to focus on asking the questions, not answering them, and getting the answers to them and learning what's going on, rather than the data first. Like the data is where you go to after you have figured out what it is you want to learn. And in order to avoid drowning in the data, hire help. Perhaps it's useful for you to learn a little bit about how to use Google Analytics, but analytics, Google Analytics, digital analytics, it's over 20 years now. There are lots of freelancers and companies, and just as your core is usability and user experience design and those kinds of areas, human factors, digital analysts, if we needed to run a study or something like that, we probably wouldn't run it ourselves. We'd come to someone like you folks to run the studies so that we don't end up in the pitfalls of leading the person and all those other things that you can do to influence the outcome. You're experienced at that. So hire the help and look to them to answer the questions for you. Okay. And so when I say focus on asking the questions that you already are asking when you are going to do a usability study or are looking to improve the user experience. If you're looking to improve the user experience, like what is it you're trying to improve? What behavior are you looking for that the user is not succeeding at? And how do you know what is it that you need to observe to tell you that they're succeeding? Right? So that kind of question, if you ask that, like it's got nothing to do with the Google Analytics, digital analytics. It's what do you expect them to do that tells you that they're succeeding, whether it is that they get to a certain point, they complete a task or something like that. And then once you figure that out, then can you actually see whether or not the user is succeeding? And that's where the help of the analysts, the digital analysts, the ones who actually know what's going on, they can help answer this question for you about whether or not you can see it. So what I mean by the most interesting behaviors are not automatically measured. It's that things like if you expect someone to complete watching a video, that's actually not automatically detected by Google Analytics or any tool. You need to collect that data expressly because Google Analytics and most analytics tools like Adobe Analytics, for example, as well, were all created when the websites were pages. And so whenever you went to another page, there's something that executes in the browser and some data is sent to Google, Adobe, and others. But a lot of interesting behaviors like watching a video, or you have in-page tabs or something like that, or an expander on a site where you click and then more content is exposed, or a pop-up window, or a dynamic form. Let's say you're ordering something and you start out and shipping and billing are collapsed and you confirm that the quantities and that kind of thing. And then you continue and then shipping opens up, you enter your address, and then billing opens up and you enter your credit card information, and then you confirm your order and you submit it. So the problem is that all of those parts might actually be completely invisible, and what might be detected out of the box with the regular analytics tool is that person landed on page, and that's it, right? So part of this is that it's a bit too much to put the burden on everybody to figure that out. And what is really, really necessary is that you figure out what it is that you need to be able to see, and then let others sort out what actually is collected and that you need. So if there is a gap between what data you have and what measurements you have and what you need, that's when you should hire analysts to answer the questions for you. Okay. And by the way, if you have any questions about this, put them in the chat, and I've got that open as well, trying to keep an eye on it. So what do I mean by focus on asking the questions? And to demonstrate that, I'm going to use 4 different examples. So one is search versus browse. And I guess, Paul, I have a question for you guys. Do you still, when I was in usability and everything, there was this big debate between Jared Spool and somebody else about whether people actually search dominant or not. And at that time, what happened was that someone did a study, and no matter whether someone said they were search dominant or not, if you put a very highly usable website in front of them, they browse, right? So ever since then, we've been thinking that, okay, well, people need to, like searching is potentially means that there's a usability problem or an issue, because they shouldn't really search, right? So anyway, if that's still a, oh, there's someone waiting, Ron's waiting to be admitted. So if that's still relevant, then I'm going to go through some questions that can help uncover that. You might run in a situation where you suspect that the wording is causing behavior that's suboptimal. People are not proceeding in the path that you would expect, and it's causing detours or other behavior that's causing frustration that you might want to quantify. And you might want to quantify usability path observations, such as people started here and then they went, and instead of watching the video, they actually searched, and it appears they couldn't find what they needed, and then they left the site. Right? So if you wanted to quantify that, like how many times did that happen, there is a way to do that as well. And then the last one is to demonstrate that if you're interested in finding out if certain pages are slow, like if you suspect that the way it's constructed or something, it's got images that seem to be overwhelming, that the slowness of the page loading is potentially degrading the experience, there is a way to get that as well from analytics. But I'm also providing that as an example, because there needs to be a bit of a caution with some reports. You can't just take the numbers without asking questions. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these 4 examples, and if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand as well through the participant area in Zoom. Okay, so first thing is, are they browsing or searching on site? And so let's say that for most sites, it's searching is a behavior that potentially is a not the optimal thing to happen. So these are the questions that digital analytics can typically answer for you, whether it's Google or otherwise. What proportion of visitors use on-site search? Because if there is a search box and people type terms in, most tools, Google Analytics can do it pretty well automatically if you have search set up a certain way. But most tools can tell you what proportion of those who did searched. Then what terms did they search with? So what did they type into the on-site search box? And one story that goes from fairly, I guess it's probably about 10 years old at this point, is that it used to be that the way sites were organized was that the shareholder area was called something like an investor center. And in this situation, what we saw was that people were coming to the site. They would look at Investor Center and not see what they needed. Then they would type in invest in a site. And then they would end up at the area where they could understand how to apply to be a franchisee. So in terms of what the user was thinking when they came in was that I'm looking to invest in a retail location. And when they saw Investor Center, they immediately went there, but that was for shareholders. So by putting in the longer search term, then that would tell us what they were looking for. And the next thing that's useful is that you can usually tell what page they searched on. So therefore, you could look at where did they go to before and at what point did they search. And so it might give you some idea of, you could go back and take a look at what terms might be confusing there, and by the number of searches that happen on that page, you can quantify how big a problem it is. And then most importantly, what happens after they do search? Do they leave the site or do they stay and go further? And if the site is for lead generation or purchasing or something like that, or you're trying to provide some information and it looks like they've gone down a certain path and then they search and then they leave right from the search results page, that's not really a good thing, because in many ways that would be a failure. So if you do see that kind of behavior in your usability study or something like that, or you suspect that that's happening, then this area of reports would help you quantify how much of a problem that is. Okay. So that's on-site search. Okay. So the next item that I had was unclear wording, or that a message is causing confusion. And so one behavior that you might see, and this is a term that I recall from my past, was pogo sticking, where they go back and forth. And this is something that if you have a specific pattern that you're looking for, and I'm actually going to go into Google Analytics just to show you what's possible here. There's something called a sequence segment, and a sequence segment allows you to say, give me or show me the number of people, put them in a segment. They started out and it did action 1 and then action 2 and action 3. And whether or not it's one right after the other, like they came to this page, went to page 2, then checked out or filled out a form or something like that, you could have one right after the other. Or you could say they landed, they did a bunch of things, and then they went to this other page, they wandered around again, and then they came back and they finally filled out the form. So this is what a sequence segment setup page looks like. And anybody who has access to Google Analytics can actually do this. And the reason for pulling this up, there's a couple of features, and it is that there are options here that you can say whether you want to have this segment be a tight segment, like, so I called it an immediate pogo versus a loose pogo, where step 1 is immediately followed by step 2 is immediately followed by step 3. Or you can have that step 1 and then they wandered around and they did step 2 and wandered around and did step 3. So if you were to select is immediately followed by, then it's step 1, step 2, step 3. But if you click the drop down and select a different one, then it can be a bit looser. So what's great about this is, and this is something that if your organization or you use Google Analytics, you might actually want to learn how to do this, because over on the right on the screen where the 0.15 is, that's actually telling you what percentage of your total audience did this. And so if it's 0, well then why ask for it in the first place? So this is something that you might want to learn how to create these segments, because it gives you a running change in it as you change the different options. So you could even say, okay, well, I want to see what happens when is immediately followed by for 3 steps. and then you change it to just is followed by. So it's the looser kind of thing, and the proportion might go up. And oftentimes, if it is you're intending for it to be a tight funnel or a tight sequence, and they wander off, there's a good chance they're not going to come back, right? So this is one way to potentially inform whether or not there is some distraction or something like that that might need to be minimized, to make sure that if what you are trying to do is have people go through step 1, 2, and 3 very quickly, that it is actually executed in that sequence. Okay. So for this one, I would say it's I wouldn't necessarily go to an analyst and say, I want a sequence segment report. Explain to them what you are trying to answer and the differences that direction that you might take depending on the type of answer you get back, and ideally let them figure it out, unless you're already savvy enough to try this out yourself. Okay, so that was a path where you wanted to quantify and take a look at a very specific situation. Now, if you want to quantify a path you observed in usability tests, some might, you should describe to your analyst what you want to learn. Some people will ask for a path report, and I would say that don't ask for a path report, because the path reports are actually very, very busy and difficult to read. And like, I put the screenshot on because this is what they look like, and they look very busy, and it looks like there's a lot of data, but it's mostly useless. Like, I have never found use for this thing. A sequence segment where you can put in your path that you're looking for and actually get a number saying, here's the number of people that did do that. That's actually much more useful oftentimes. But if you are partnered up with an analyst in your company or agency or others, they should be able to discuss this with you and advise on which method would be better, and hopefully they would get you the data rather than you having to get that yourself. And then the last one was about site speed. So this is the speed at which pages load. And whether or not an experience on site, like the faster pages load, the more likely a user is to convert, and the better the user experience overall, because they're not getting frustrated. So the reason for bringing this up is that if someone is sending you an automated report, I think the thing to do is always have a conversation about whether what you're taking away from it is actually correct. And the reason for caution on this one is that this is an actual extract from the Google Merchandise Store, which is a demo account, demo data. So it's real data from Google's online merchandise store, where they sell t-shirts and bottles and all that kind of stuff with Google and YouTube branded on it. So the average time for Google's website page load speed, according to the method by they're getting it, for the month of August was 4 seconds. And you'll see that there are some pages that are a lot slower to load, 28, 20 seconds, that kind of thing. The thing is that Google, in order to get this information, is actually reloading the page, and you need to look at the size of the sample. So in this case, even though there's 21 seconds for that first one there, that's based on just one reading, and it could be that there was a problem or something like that was causing problems at that time, and that's why it took 20 seconds to load, right? So this is an example of when you say, I'd like to understand what the page load times are. A little bit of understanding about how that data is actually collected by Google and presented would be helpful, but hopefully whoever is your analyst partner would take care of you. And typically we don't we would filter out and make sure that we were getting 50 to 100 in terms of the page load sample before we made any conclusion about whether or not that was a problem. Now you can test the page itself, right? So that one that's taking 20 seconds to load, you can have someone look at it to see if that's a problem. And a developer or someone can, there are other tools than Google Analytics to do this. But this is an example of, yes, there are useful reports. You need a little bit of data a little bit of information and background to be able to tell whether or not it's a good report for you to use, and some reports might require some caution. So those are 4 examples of how you can quantify observations using Google Analytics and to help you answer questions that you might have that you want to learn about and make the case further for what you're trying to do or trying to improve. Now, if you're going to be asking these questions, I would suggest that you do it at the wireframing stage before, like, just try and think ahead to what the questions are that you might want to answer when a site is being redesigned or something like that, if you can, because it's less costly to add measurement while the site's being built. So some of these things, like needing to, if there's you click and then the content expands or something like that, to do a little bit more work and put in what needs to be collected so that that action will show up in Google Analytics or any tool. It's probably about 10 seconds per little expander. But if you wait till after and then put in a request for it to happen, the problem is that some enhancements never happen. And one of our clients, this is about 10 years ago now, they had switched analytics tools to a more sophisticated one. They ended up going back to the old one because the new tool they went to required more work. They didn't get everything into the project before they closed it off. And so then they had a list that I need this tracked, I need this tracked, I need to be able to see this, and so on. Or the site would change, and changes like the ones I described about the expanders happen, and that change didn't get in. So it was 18 months after they switched, and it still wasn't fully implemented. And that's because internal IT is always really busy, and things get prioritized, and this data collection piece sort of kept falling to the bottom every time. So that's a warning and a caution. Always try and think ahead when there's a redesign or something like that. If there's an expectation that you'll be able to quantify the benefit of some of the redesign changes, think ahead about what you might need to be able to detect, and then ask whoever you're working with, is that going to be there automatically, or is that something we need to add to the scope now, so that when evaluating it later, I will be able to answer the question. Okay, so that's one tip there for you. Okay. So that concludes the formal part of what I was going to present. And there is one question here. Okay, and yeah, so the next thing was Q&A. So Teddy, there's a question here. Can I read it out? It's sent to me privately, but.
No, sure.
Okay. So when you do usability testing, you often don't know what you're looking for. If you have one day to measurements once.
So if you're doing, say, testing, and then you find out what's wrong and what you want to capture, then would you at some point, once you do know what you're looking for, add this in as part of your measurement, or would you do it completely separate? Or does anybody do that? Do they combine the testing like this with this kind of analytics?
If the data is there and you have a good partner, or then yeah, you can do that. Like we did where I was working before. We did get to the point where we could answer that for most of it, but then we would run into situations where we could not. And in that case, what we were then doing is that in future projects, we would actually try and foresee what we might need to answer. So I agree that in usability tests, you typically can't foresee all the issues. However, as you build up a reservoir of knowledge, you know that uh, where some of the issues might be.
Yeah,
And
at a high level you do, but at a detailed level you often don't. And so what happens more frequently is that, for example, a company wants to redesign their site,
Mhm.
and they understand that they need to put a benchmark in to say, so how well is my current site performing? And so that's typically a moment where you do a usability test to say, okay, let's find out what the current issues are, capture those, and make sure that our redesign is better, or at least captures or addresses these issues. And so I wonder, but we hardly ever do a quantitative study to prove, quote unquote, prove that. We typically do a test there because, like I said, I see it as a separate thing, or as a separate kind of piece of research to find out. But it would be nice if you do a test and right after that you can say, okay, let's quantify this now. Let's
yeah,
run some analytics for a week or two to find out if those analytics back up what we're finding in the test.
yeah. So it's ideally it's there historically rather than going and getting it. So that's why it would be useful to um, have that information. You think through what the likely things are. So your example of uh, how well is our website performing? I would challenge the whoever's asking that question, like, what do you mean by well? Right? What does success look like? And so if they say, oh, I want to make sure that people who come from my marketing campaign or land on here, that they convert or they fill out the form or something like that. And so ahead of time, before you do the usability study, you could ask whether or not that data is being collected, right? And like if you are testing a form or something like that, you could say ask ahead of time, like if I wanted to know where people were dropping out for these steps, could you tell me or not? Right. So some things they would be able to tell you ahead of time whether it's even collected, right? Or not.
Yeah, and I would agree with that if that was something you were able to do. Very often, though, you just get the blanket statement, we need a better site. So it's much more about, not so much about knowing absolute numbers where we are. It's just it
Yeah,
needs to be better than what it is today. And can we figure out where to focus on, or at least learn from our current sites as much as we can before we start to do a redesign.
right.
Yeah.
I would challenge them to explain why they need the better site. And in the same way that like if you have a store and you want to do a redesign, like there's more investment in it, right? You have to have some sort of business reason to do it, whether it's that you'll have more traffic or people will stay longer or something like that, right? So I have a story about a situation with one of my clients where it's pretty sure they're going to run into the trouble because the business owner of the section had not enunciated why the redesign was happening. And so you should. So I'm talking to the analyst, not the group that was funding it. Sure enough, the boss 2 levels up comes and says, "I'd like to know whether we met our objectives for the redesign." And the person came back to me and said, "I tried to get objectives and I could not get objectives." So we inferred some, didn't quite get what was needed. So when the presentation then was quite weak, so then the manager said, "No, I want to know whether it worked." So we ended up deconstructing and like this is not the right way to do it. But okay, you moved the video from here to here. Therefore, you must have expected that that is something that would be better, right? So that's the kind of thing that. Um, so in we encourage everybody to really think about like how do you know what success looks like? Like what's better? If I don't have an idea of what better is, it's going to be very difficult to say whether or not people are doing it. And we have people come to analytics classes and we say that, like, you should find out what the objective was, or else how do you know what to measure against? Like, it just isn't clear. And we actually send them we encourage them to go and talk with whomever, that if they're coming to measure a specific site, find out what the objective is of the site. And it's less now than 15 years ago, where 15 years ago, the objective of having a website was having a website. And then they worried about usability. So it's not quite that way anymore, because it's quite expensive to build and maintain, right? But it is still a problem. And so we definitely try to get out of them. So why are you investing in this? What do you hope to see? How does it help your business? And that helps us try and decide what kind of investment on the measurement side would be useful.
I have a similar story to that. A team came to me one time and they said, we revamped our website and we've got all these analytics from the old site and the new site. Help us figure out if it's better or not. We got like all kinds of, any kind of data you could ever want, you know, like.
Yeah, and the
like,
problem
how do we tell them if it's better or not?
Yeah. You actually need to go and collect the definitive baseline before you make the changes.
That's right.
Because now you're apples and oranges, and it's really difficult to do. Yeah. So unfortunately, it does fall back typically on the usability, user experience folks to push a little bit further and get that ahead of time. And that's a teaching moment, so that the next time you hear about something happening, a redesign of something like that, try and encourage them to think ahead of what is it that you're going to want to know when this happens. Like, what's your question? And let's make sure you get a better answer than what we were able to provide in the past. So does that help?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, like I said, I don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah.
The idea of having a business answer to a web redesign absolutely needs to be answered. I completely agree with that. And if that's not the case, you need to do that. But I'm talking about this moment past that. So once you establish that and you know that you're going to do it for whatever good or not so good business reasons, now you need to set that baseline. And like you said, Paul, that after the fact to prove that something's better. But now I'm talking about, oftentimes analytics is used to set a baseline. Oftentimes also a usability test is used as a baseline for design. And so that's the moment I'm talking about here, is that, do you do this on the fly, or do you really see this as separate projects? Because we tend to treat them as separate projects and not try to do them at the same time. But I'm wondering, given what you just showed, if there's a timing or there's nimbleness enough to actually do it at the same time and still get reasonable data, even though you have to run these analytics for a little while, or maybe retroactively go back to your path analysis and say, okay, you go back to your data that's already there and fill in the numbers that you just showed and filter it that way and get the answer right away.
Right. Yeah. So if the data is collected, it's more a resource problem to get the answer. It's where if the data is not collected and now you have to start collecting, then if it's not being collected, usually that means that there's some developer assistance required, and then you got to queue up that resource and so on. So that in that case, it's not fast. But if it's already there, someone will be able to get it out pretty quickly. So I would ask, like, if you have the opportunity to ask the resource there, I would ask. Do a test in some cases to see whether it would help and be there.
Yep.
Okay.
There's another question in the chat there.
Yep, I see. Yeah. Any thoughts on using heat map and recording tools with data analytics? Yep, Hotjar, absolutely. So that's also complementary and definitely very useful. When we're using Hotjar, we usually like to have that paired with some sort of survey, so they actually state what they're doing. Because you can watch it and you still don't know what's going on. So we actually like where there's a survey that says, and it doesn't have to be complicated, you can somehow marry up the survey data to the heat map and the recording tool, so that if they say, I came to do X, and you ask them how satisfied they are. but they still had a lot of problem with it. But they said they were really satisfied. Then it might be that based on who they are and what the experience and everything is, maybe your site is actually better, even though they might be going all over the place. But it's difficult sometimes to split out browsing and just learning behavior from where somebody is confused, right? And unless you've asked some sort of question ahead of time, or it's clear that like there's a link or something that they click on if they're new versus not, and there's some way to classify them. So definitely, yeah, heat maps and recording tools that record the clicks and what people type in, so long as you got a mask over all the personal stuff, definitely useful for sure. And sometimes if you have the budget for something like that, to have both the survey and something like Hotjar, then it can help set up what kind of usability study would be more productive, rather than using that for research first. Okay.
Yeah, I had a question for you. So you mentioned earlier about the importance of defining the questions, to ask, before you get too far in the weeds. Do you have any examples of interesting or offbeat questions that clients have been interested or asked you about, or things they want to find out?
For that are usability kind of, I can tell you the ones that I used that helped me quantify issues in the past. One was they hadn't left enough white space around the search box, and people couldn't even search. So our the people use on-site search, what usability showed was they didn't even know the search box was there. That was one problem. We've also had situations where people will put in the search box when we're watching them. We ask them to do a task in the usability evaluation, and they can actually browse, but they type in the word. So like locations, or a word that's actually in a tab right there. They'll plug that in there, and that indicates that they are it's too crowded. They're not seeing it, right? And we use, in both those cases, we use analytics to say, okay, on the home page, how many people searched for that word on the home page? And that's how we quantified it with analytics. And in that case, the data was already there, so we were able to answer that. Another example about it slipped my mind there what I was thinking of. So there's a financial institution who has a complicated form. It's a joint application, so two people fill out the form. And what we have put in place for them is we measure the number of times someone clicks on a field. And the ratio then of the number of times people go back to that field, what they were able to, they're just sort of scanning it, and 1.1, like 10% seemed to go back and change things. There was one that was 1.4, so 40% were going back and changing it. And then as they thought about it, they thought, okay, two things. Either the description of what that is isn't clear, and then they get further down the form, and then they go back and change it. And that's where a heat map would be really helpful to see if that's actually the sequence, because we weren't able to see the sequence. We just see that more people are clicking on it. So then they did some experiments, changing the order of the fields on the form, changing the description, and what happened then is the ratio went back to 1.1, which is pretty much what the average was for that form. So this form had 30 fields. By the time you got through the whole thing, the application form was 30 fields. And by measuring that ratio, they were able to zero in on an issue that was likely a usability problem, and go from there. Does that help a little bit?
Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Any other questions for our speaker, for June? Well, I'll ask maybe one more if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Just curious about just your experience with A/B testing. Is there a lot of clients who are doing that? Is a lot of interest in that, or is that sort of come and gone, or what's the?
Oh no, always should be testing. Everyone always has a different opinion, and even if you come up with some conclusions for what might be wrong or that kind of thing, then yeah, test it. Let the market and the users decide on what's happening. And Google has Google Optimize now with the visual editor, so it's if it's a relatively simple HTML page, you need to swap an image, size of image, some copy, change the order of positioning on the page. Google Optimize is free to sign up and use to try out. Right, so you can do multivariate with it as well, and you can also personalize. Like on our website, for example, one of the sections, like the style that went across after the last time around was that you hit a major section, there's a big banner page, like visual interest image there to signal you're in a section. But the blog, it just made no sense to have the blog say blog. You're in the blog. And the behavior of the people who come to the website is that they actually land on a specific post that says, it's some question they've asked, they land on the post, and then they go from there to blog home. So you already know that you're on the blog. You don't need something that says blog. So currently we have running, rather than go and get the designer to take that big picture out, what we have is a long-term personalization that says on that page, take out the picture, and did not need a web designer to do that. Right. So those are the kinds of things that you can do. And if you suspect that different people coming in from different places need a slightly different message on the page in order to make sure they know they're in the right place and they know what to do next. It used to be that you'd have to create a separate page now for every one of those different locations or something like that. But you can key off the URL or even their location, time of day, browser, whatever might be available, and change the copy, change the message, even put a different link there. All of those things are possible. And you have to have understood A/B testing and testing in order to do that kind of personalization, because you need to continuously evaluate whether or not that's the right thing to do. So those are some of the other things that can be done with other parts of the Google tools that are available.
Good. That's good to hear. Thanks. Good. Okay, just a final call for any other questions before we wrap up here? No? Good. So I'll wrap up here and we'll end the recording. So thanks very much, June. Oh, did you want to plug your?
Well, it's just if anyone has any questions about tonight, I mean, it's quite a lot of information, or as you're watching the replay, you've got a question, please reach out to me. My email is there. And we do have a free webinar series we're doing right now. It's roughly an hour and a half each one. It is intended for marketers, and actually we are pushing them to define their objectives. That's the whole purpose of this. And so how to succeed with Google Analytics without becoming a data expert. It's what I've shared with you tonight, where get clear about what the objectives are. And with that, you can then identify a group of key metrics that are just right for you, not your industry or whatever, right for you and your situation, your website, and what you're trying to do. And spend the time on getting that and then drilling down through that, and then get help to help you do this, because there are articles out there about how data analytics is a missing skill that CMOs need, and we totally disagree with that. We think that the CMOs and the marketers need to be able to ask the questions and determine what they want to learn about their customers, similar to what I've emphasized tonight. So that's what that webinar is. You're all welcome to attend, or like if you have folks who are marketers who you wish they would define the objectives and be more clear about it, send them to our webinar. as well. It's not aimed at analysts. This webinar is aimed at business people. Okay.
Good. Sounds very interesting.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So I will just pause.